So I guess this is great. I have a kind of a practical question. So obviously, OpenCHAMI is an open source project. If we're simulating stuff in GCP, is this something that like HPE could support, or how would this work? Or
Great question, Chris. So I've talked to higher ups at HPE, and at least initially, for the time being, that is like the cost is relatively small, as long as this first one holds true, right? And that's something that that HPE could take care of. Does that give long-term guarantees that HPE will always do that? Is that something that, as a community project, you would want to have, resting in the corporate hands? So I don't. Are there other approaches? I mean, running the integration tests locally, running them on hardware, right? The VTDS can run on a workstation laptop. Like, that is a possibility. But yeah, I don't know. Alex, do you have any thoughts about, or anybody else? This is kind of a governance.
Does it support other cloud providers as well, or?
It can. Yeah, there's some work being done for AWS right now, and that is abstracted away. There's a provider layer, so we could have AWS is in the works. Could have a local provider. Could have, I don't know, OpenStack or whatever you would want, just with a little bit of work.
So two things to comment on. One, do we want HPE paying for this forever? No. There are facilities within HPSF, and then our own OpenCHAMI board could collect money and then spend it. And so both of those are possible. So we could move to, funded by the organization rather than funded by HPE. The challenges around that right now have to do with a bunch of governance nonsense. I guess not nonsense, just like things that we have not covered at the board level for OpenCHAMI yet, that we will probably cover at our next board meeting. Just how do we collect money? Like, who writes the check? Where does the check go? Those are questions that are very difficult. And then that entity, whoever it is that collects the money, then could sign up for a GCP account or an AWS account. And even through the Linux Foundation, we get some very favorable terms to deal with the cloud vendors. Having said that, one of the things that makes GCP really well suited for something like this is that all of their instances allow for, nested virtualization. But with AWS, the smallest node that does support nested virtualization is like a large or an extra large, which means that it's a much bigger commitment to do this on AWS versus GCP, and that's part of how the costs have been maintained so low for you guys so far. So, as we think through what other providers might be interesting, nested virtualization becomes a requirement to think about. Did I cover? Yeah.
It does. I get the impression that it, apart from that consideration for nested virtualization, otherwise any of the providers would be acceptable. There's no, I don't know, funding or institutional bias. Okay. Yeah, I some other questions that come up would be, and I guess they get tied into cost. So, is this something, the model that we proposed here, where these tests, like the virtual cluster is not going to get stood up and run through the tests until somebody presses a button and says merge that PR. Is that, how sustainable is that model, right? There are obvious reasons for doing it, to control the costs and not have a bunch of stuff that spins up a bunch of expensive, but yeah, how far does that get us?
I have a philosophical response to that I'd be interested to see if other people agree with or disagree with. I think that we need to incentivize per repo testing covering as much as possible. Because if we have to wait until the integration test, which costs more and takes longer to run before we discover like bugs in the way that one service talks to another, then it means we're not doing a good job of containing our tests at the repo level. We obviously do need integration tests. We want to know when those things, when our assumptions get broken. But if we rely too heavily on them to catch things, like that means we're not doing our homework on the individual services level. That's my, I don't know if other people have thoughts.
I don't have thoughts about like what we should do, but okay. I'm pretty sure there's a working group for this, right, in HPSF about like CI pipeline, CI/CD. So I mean, I'm just saying they might have like idea for how to get these resources, or you know what I mean, like implementation details. I'm just, since we're here at HPSF, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think that group has just started, so I'm not. Yeah.
Oh,
So,
I thought you meant like.
yeah. So I think, I mean, yeah, that's probably be a good resource in the future for sure. So in terms of like whether you run it like when things get merged or not. So in previous projects that I've worked on, where the time cost associated with doing kind of integration tests, like, you know, they took hours to run. We always took the approach of doing kind of nightlies, which is something that you can do. You can do scheduled builds with GitHub as well. So that's one approach. And then the other question I had about this is, so this is obviously targeted for kind of, you know, running it in GCP. How easy is it for like developers to run it like locally on their laptop, or like to, you know, to set up and develop these integration tests? Is that something that's easy to do, or?
Yeah. So Eric has given he gave a presentation at the Dev Summit in Austin, walking through it. It was maybe a little more verbose than like for accessibility. We'd like to see a little more traction with that, right? Like it's very detailed, and you can walk through it. But yeah, you can with your own, you know, GCP. Right.
So you can't run it, like I can't run it on my dev machine at the moment.
Not currently. Like the local provider level layer would need some work, but you can locally. Like this doesn't have to be. Right.
But you have you need credentials for GCP.
But the actual cost is very, very minimal. I mean.
Yeah, I would say that was a bit of a like one kind of sticking point in terms of adoption, if you require developers to have GCP accounts.
That was something that we discussed, right? Like where does this fit in priorities?
Just from the point of view of developing the tests themselves, like.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at the time, whenever we were discussing this, the priority was to get to work on the mechanism for automating a test, any kind, right? You know, working on the GitHub Actions and get that workflow going, and then we could revisit that. But I mean, you make good points, and I don't know if anybody, like, maybe there are two options here. We could put effort into being able to prototype the testing locally, or get it hooked up to GitHub. Yeah.
I mean, before we even get to the point where we're talking about how we're doing the test, you know, how we're building the virtualized cluster or whatever, what tests are we hoping to do? Because, you know, a lot of OpenCHAMI functionality, especially as we're adding new things to it, is likely going to be very hardware specific, and we're not going to, other than like API integrations, you know, API validations, what are we really able to test in a generic environment?
Another really good question. You know, we have been on the initial discussions. We're in agreement that we're going to want integration tests, right? But we didn't get that far. You know, there was the profit, right?
Yeah, I'd like to give a simple example. For example, in PCS currently, there are tests, integration tests, which is essentially done in Docker Compose. So it spins up the services like SMD, it spins up the power control service, and then it spins up some Redfish emulators, and it does power cycling of those. And so, a natural progression of that is to actually do that on, real virtual nodes. And so that sort of thing would probably work in a kind of generic sense. And so that's testing how PCS interacts with SMD. It's testing how the PCS interacts with the VMC. Yeah. Sorry.
So I think that there's the hardware integration testing, which we should be doing, which has to do with Redfish emulators. And so just having an emulator that looks like an iDRAC or an ILO or whatever else is useful, especially if we have some indication that it is like still accurate. Because we've got some emulators that we know the hardware doesn't behave the way that the emulator does. And so if we've got a bunch of emulators that don't work, then that's not as valuable to us. But there's other stuff like an integration test that builds a cluster of 10 virtual nodes, right? And then groups them differently and then reboots them multiple times and has them like reprocessing their boot scripts and reprocessing their Cloud Init scripts to make sure that we get an outcome, like a desired state that we indicate. Those kinds of things also will help to catch integration changes, right? So if we were to do the bootc, we were talking about replacing our current boot process with bootc yesterday. I don't know if that's a good idea. I don't know if it's a bad idea. But if we were going to do it, trying to be able to run it with the old version and the new version and see if timings change, see if the time it takes to resolve Cloud Init is somehow different between the two. And those are hard to test in an isolation setup. So those are some non-hardware things that I would imagine we would want to test.
Come on, wake back up.
I can't say anything without the slides.
Without the slides, we're lost. Well, when the slides come back, did you have a question?
Were we going to do this with, I'm assuming we're going to do this, kick all this off with, GitHub Actions, right? Those aren't free anymore. Well, so if you self-host, they're not free anymore. So you have to pay for self-hosted, per, I don't know what the rate is, but.
So this wouldn't be self-hosted, would it? It would be in there.
So through
So if you're going to run a GitHub action, my understanding, I read the press release. Is you can configure your own, I forget what they call it, GitHub action runner.
Yeah.
And you do all the wiring and plumbing to hook it up to your repo and make sure no one else can use it, right? Because that's the scary part, right? And I think you would need something like that for this, unless you were gonna do use a generic one that sends some API request thing to kick it off or whatever. But that sounds more complicated then. But if you're gonna host your own runner and have it run CI jobs from your repo, that is no longer free. And I don't know how expensive. So if we're gonna do this every time someone makes a change or something, right, or pushes or makes a PR or nightly, right? That's just something to think about, is that it costs money now to build your own infrastructure, right?
I
So
think my understanding of this is that it could run in GitHub Action infrastructure, and it reaches out to GCP to generate the cluster. Is that right?
Yes, and
Yeah.
that's the way that we have set it up in the past.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just a point of clarification, part of what we get as part of through HPSF is a very high tier of GitHub accounts. And so so we had problems before where we were limited to 10 users, and now there's no cap on our users. I mean, there's some cap, but functionally we should never think about it. The other thing is we've got a ton of GitHub action runners that come with it, and because it's spread across so many projects in Linux Foundation, we're in no danger of having problems with GitHub limits. I think that'll be true with GCP and AWS eventually, but it's definitely true with GitHub today.
Do we get any break on like Copilot stuff or?
Yeah. All of the Copilot stuff that currently is running in our pipeline, so like automatic summary of the pull requests, or the Copilot thing that is currently generating our newsletter, and our all that is running for free. We've got a huge number of privileged requests, and we haven't even touched. We're barely scratching the surface of what is provided through GitHub.
I guess the only other thing I'll mention, as we're working on this, the way that we've handled this internally, we've used the Terraform GitHub provider to kind of automate this stuff and manage our repos. So David Fluck, another developer who has there's some onboarding that he's working through, but he's also working on providing Terraform to help set this up and help manage the repos in a consistent way. I don't know if anybody else, if that sounds like a good idea to people, something that you do. Otherwise, if there are thoughts about Terraform for GitHub repo management.
So is that to set up the GitHub actions to run this? Is that?
Yeah,
right.
Because you have actions that run on each of the individual repos, the way that we're envisioning it,
right.
Actions that run on the individual repos that trigger the creation of a PR at some other repo called the deployment repo, right? Merging a PR there triggers the, sending things off for integration test. So getting all of that consistent, there are credentials and tokens and things like that need to be passed around, and those are easy to mess up just going through settings. But it doesn't sound like there are any objections to that.
I guess I'll flip this around. Is there integration testing to assure everyone in the room that OpenCHAMI hasn't broken as you build your next release, as we build our next system? Is there anything you feel like this wouldn't capture that we should be thinking about, or are there other sorts of integration testing that we should be, feedback that we should be giving to Eric on what we might want to do?
I mean, not speaking for the kind of vendors, but presumably there are hardware specific kind of integration tests that you'd want to perform to ensure that the hardware specific features are not being broken by changes. So there might I guess what I'm thinking, that there might be value in having GitHub runners specific to particular vendors that could also run on real hardware, I guess. For example, at HPE or at Dell.
So either real hardware or the specifically configured VPS profile, right? Which obviously there's a bias toward HPE hardware because an HPE engineer wrote it, but it should be generalizable.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know how much vendor-specific things we can do within the OpenCHAMI repo, right? Because it's access to these resources, right? So that I think that's a harder question to answer, and I don't know that we have to have a complete pipeline that just does test the whole world, right? Because at some point each vendor is going to do their own testing before they like check mark a release, right? I mean, hopefully, right? And then everybody who uses this software is going to probably have something they check, hopefully, right? But you know, it just becomes like who is responsible and then where that responsibility ends, right? So I don't know. If we have a set of tests that run things and we think that having this VTDS should be part of that, then I think we should just get like set boundaries. So that, because you could spend like your entire career doing this, right? You spend all your time doing this. This is like a ton of work, right? And then something changes and you have to go back and revisit the whole thing. So,
I mean, it's I think part of the question is like, you know, HPE is putting this together because HPE wants to validate that the things that we are putting together like are going to continue to work on this. And Dell's probably going to do your own release management and your own testing. Does it make sense to have shared integration testing that is working between the two vendors and is something that we can see? Or do vendors want their own like inside the fence testing frameworks that are doing their own thing and then they file bugs? For the community, I want as much to be like out in the open as possible, but I'm also not running a company. Do you have thoughts on that? Do you guys have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think I don't know about HPE, but I know in the Dell case there will be a process where we're bringing OpenCHAMI in-house and we're possibly doing a little bit of amending to it, for the vendor-specific parts. For the most part, though, I think it's going to be more the case that we're going to want to just validate that a tagged release or something like that works on a particular platform. And it might be worthwhile if there was a set of tests in the repo that, like, if we run these tests and we get the results, we get the validated results back, we can just post back to OpenCHAMI as like, this vendor's product foo works with this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, like, when Travis was talking about the hosted runners, like, if you had a hosted runner that ran inside your world and, like, didn't have to send out, like, here's how I'm doing this, but, like, here's the validation that this worked, and this worked, and this worked, and here's an attestation that our next version is going to work, that is
Right.
That can be public while your runner can be private, if you want to do things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if it needs to be as complicated as a runner. It could just be that there's a predefined
Be a
test suite, and then we just send the report back.
Yeah. John and Mary go run the tests manually and then sign their name to it and say, here we go, we're ready to go. Yeah. Which, if we're not doing it that frequently, that can work just fine, right? If you want to do it on every check-in, that's a lot of work for John and Mary.
No, I think that's why, instead of in that case, it's probably not a continuous integration test.
Yeah.
It's a release test. So when we tag something in OpenCHAMI, whichever service we're tagging, at that point, that's when we can say, okay, we're going to just run the validation test.
So a related idea to this is, and it goes back to what Travis was saying about the CI CD working group within this organization. Certainly, we have like runners that, for example, run on Perlmutter. Obviously, we have to be very careful about like who we allow access to, but that sort of is another way to support real multiple hardware kind of things. Yeah. So for example, we could possibly run a runner on one of our kind of test environments. Is another option.
Yeah, and we would probably want to be able to test things so that it's, time to market, right? So when we know we're going to have a release of OpenCHAMI, we'd like to be able to say, as soon as that is announced, that we are ready to go. And that means that all the testing we do before that is on products that may not exist yet.
Yeah.
And so having a runner is not going to happen. Our networks are not going to connect to the outside world, because whenever we're building, whenever we're working on pre-production hardware, that's in an enclosed space. We're not touching the outside world with that hardware.
Well, so this gets into release management as well, because one of the reasons you want to do a lot of integration testing is to prepare for a release. And OpenCHAMI doesn't have a unified release. There's the Dell version. There's the version that you guys are working on. We currently maintain a repo called the release repo, because we had no idea what else to do. But I don't think that LANL wants to be the ones declaring, right, like a release cadence for the vendors that are working on this. So do we want an open source validation at the release repo level that then gives vendors like start here, add your stuff, and then this would be on top of that, which now gives the release repo a reason to exist, because it is the thing that we're going to do our primary validation on before it becomes a per vendor release process. This is a question. I'm just spitballing.
I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Something that has a documented test process and results, right? Like, okay, we've done this, we've tested this, and then Dell goes off and makes whatever changes, and as long as they run those tests and get those same results, then you have some assurance that it's doing okay, and it matches that release. Yeah, totally. And I think one take home that I, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but being able to have a local provider seems to be increasingly valuable, because that's how, if you were to use this virtualized system, right? I mean, like, apart from, the alternative would be that you just install it on the hardware and run the tests, but.
Yeah, I think just installing it and running it is most likely the default option. I mean, we could get more sophisticated with runners that we connect on the local infrastructure. I don't think for existing hardware that would be fine. Mm-hmm. For pre-production hardware, if we're getting ready to time an OpenCHAMI release with the release of a large system announcement, which is typically pre-production hardware, then we would not want to have a runner that can be invoked from the outside world touch that hardware.
So maybe that begs the question of, like, how do we represent the actual test steps? Like, where do those live? Is this you walk through the tutorial, or is there,
or is it an automated test?
Yeah.
I think this is a great. I think that's the question. Is that there's a difference between, as an open source collection of microservices, how we want to say these things work together, versus the commitment that a vendor might want to make to a customer, saying, here's how we have put these together. We believe we have done this in the right way to support all of our use cases. So, I don't know that, HPE doesn't necessarily have to share all of the use cases that you support with the rest of the community, and you don't have to do that either. But if you can both point to, well, here's the upstream open source version, and here are the validation tests that are shared, then we have sort of multiple layers of validation, so that customers and contributors can say, okay, well, I know what I'm working with here. I just remembering some of the earlier days of Kubernetes, where there was the upstream Kubernetes, and then there was a handful of Kubernetes, opinionated Kubernetes platforms. Mm-hmm. They still relied on the upstream Kubernetes tests to say that this is a good product, but then they added their own stuff. I presume that's a reasonable facsimile of what we should be doing here, right?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm sure there will be a HPE opinionated variant. It doesn't really, it could be a delta of 0, Same thing with Dell.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hoping that we're not going to be in a situation where things are dramatically different, because at that point the open source community is a little harder. But it's definitely a possibility. And then as other vendors choose to do their own release management on top of OpenCHAMI, we've got additional things we can look at. All right, we should move on to closing thoughts. Lunch is being served in the next 4 minutes. 4 or 5 minutes. So anything you want to, any other takeaways that you want to highlight? Anything you want to wrap up?
No. I went backwards. Yeah. We don't have to continually cycle through the slides. Thank you for the discussion. We covered a lot, and I think this was a good time to have it, given that we are still very early in the process. I really appreciate it. I don't know if I can summarize on the spot any better than that, but I will try to do so in text, and we can iterate on it and hopefully come up with something that works for everybody. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The one thing I heard, there is the CI working group with HPSF. Does anyone in this room want to get involved in that, or should we, someone want to try to attend one of the first meetings and see if it works for us?
I know the guy that's running it.
Okay. So Chris Harris will do that. Okay.
I'm joining the web. Speak to Zach.
You'll speak to Zach. Okay. We'd like to. I want to make sure that we're participating as good members of HPSF.
Where is Zach?
He's at Kitware.
Okay.
All right. Let me check the schedule. I think we come back here at 1.